This is Brent Richardson, and welcome to the Business Minutia Podcast, where our focus is on the details of business that are often passed over by traditional classes and leadership training. We focus on the stories of real people who have tried, failed, and learned through their experiences and are willing to share their lessons with others. All right, Jamie, so you're going to meet with HR tomorrow. What does that mean to you?
I am being fired.
You're being fired.
That's like being called into the principal's office, Brent. Why do I want to meet with HR?
You're going to meet with the police, or it's a similar kind of mentality. It's the similar feeling when you're getting pulled over for a ticket almost.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It sounds like you have had a more positive experience with HR than I have in my life.
I've had plenty of bad experiences, but I have had some really good experiences as well. And I'd say my experiences the past 10 years have been way better once I learned how to interact with HR.
Yeah, I wish I knew that when I was working at a big company.
I also wish I'd known that when I started. This is why we want to have this conversation. What was your highlight, or what's the best part of the episode that you kind of took away from?
I loved the idea of the younger generations living out loud and being on social media and how that actually impacts us in the workplace.
So how different generations interact together.
Right.
We talk a little bit about Metoo movement, the folk associated with that too, and how millennials and
yeah, and she has
ages.
a little bit of a controversial take on some of that, and I love it.
Stuff. It's good topics. Please welcome the creator and founder of the Axiom Music Agency and HR expert, and my friend Jane Kim, to the show. You can follow her on Instagram and Facebook. We'll have details wherever you follow us on social media. We'll have her tags. You can find her, or you can get details on how to connect with her on our website. Let's get started. What are some of the misconceptions that people have? Police?
It's hard to say. I mean, police, so again, it's hard to say because HR's influence ranges so wide depending on your workplace. There are people who are there just for very administrative and like payroll or like insurance type things. There are people who actually are in the room when very important decisions about who's going to be promoted or who's going to be the next director. Like when those decisions are made, there are some companies that include HR in the rooms. And so depending on the level of influence people have, you could fear them. You could think that you want to stay away and just not be on any of their radar and say, no news is good news kind of thing. I also think there's misconceptions that people in HR are not very bright.
Yeah.
I mean, I've definitely had interactions even at a very successful tech company where, because people are engineers and they might have varying PhDs in engineering, that they might think that just because you are not a technical person, that you are not as smart or you don't solve problems as well. So I think there's that misconception, which is proliferated by movies and TV shows. The HR person is always kind of like the dim-witted, mild-mannered person that doesn't cause any trouble.
With a history degree amongst a sea of PhD.
Yeah, they're like, I did English Lit and I don't know what to do, so I joined HR. That's like a common story about like Toby and whatever. Right.
It's also it's a tough job. Like we've talked about this before, and with most of the HR folks that I've worked with, we've talked about how it's you're not dealing with the best of the best, especially at a good sized company. You're dealing with the worst of the worst in most cases, and you usually have a line out the door of horror stories that you're dealing with. Right. And so, I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen HR folks that I've, worked with where I'm there to get advice and counsel, and the person winds up being in tears and I'm counseling them because it's a rough job. You're getting dumped on every day with problems that, and you have minimal that you can really do about it. And it's just draining and can wear on you in general. Right.
Yeah. And when you're at a larger company where you have to support as a business partner, not as like a specialized role in talent development or recruiting, but if you're in a more business facing role, you might be responsible for being the HR rep for like a 300 person organization. So you have to you're kind of in a way forced to make snap judgments about people you meet and the employees and managers you meet based on like one or two interactions.
Right.
And that's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's just the way that the system is structured. So that could play really poorly for certain people if I'm making misjudgments about people. And in a way, that's why we're saying now, like, try to get more interactions with your HR person so they get to know you at a more human and less superficial level.
Yeah, that was been my, just to jump to my biggest learning was We always kept HR at a distance for the reasons we mentioned, probably, and just that it was just kind of a unwritten rule that you don't engage. But my learning, having gone through the horror story that I went through, was the opposite. I should keep my HR folks engaged so that, because I recognize that those snap decisions are taking place, it can take place. I need them advocating for me, or at least being aware. If you can at least be knowledgeable and aware of who I am, so that the decision-making process is, at least, I may not like your decision, but at least it's informed consent, as opposed to people just throwing darts at a board, which it can feel like at large companies sometimes.
Totally. And if I haven't had a chance to meet you, I have to go off of what I hear about you.
That's right.
And I might ask about you to your manager or to your peers, and that's all I have to go off of.
Yeah.
And it is unreasonable to expect an HR person to have the time that they can spend only on meeting and connecting with employees, because they have a lot of other administrative stuff.
Right. And we got all kind of folks out there that could be listening to this. You'll have folks that are, individual contributor at a large company, people who are running their own companies, people who, but people who aren't real personable, that it's not natural for them to go talk to an HR person. Like, why? That's something that I had to struggle with, was how do I organically have a conversation with the person? But I don't want to go talk to my HR person when something is on fire, because I don't want them developing a perception of me that, oh, this person just comes and talks to me. Because I also I have some empathy for the role and for the job. I wouldn't want that either. So then finding a way to organically have that conversation is something that was hard for me to get to a point where now it's no problem now. I don't know what the difference is. Sometimes you just recognize that this is a manageable thing. My point is, we got all kinds of folks that'll be listening, and so you'll have folks that's a normal thing, not a problem for you, and then some that will be it'll be a little more challenging. One of the ways that helped me was, and I think I had gotten counsel from somebody else that was senior to me at the company, that said, you need to be tight with your HR people, right? And I think I went in with probably improper motivation. My mindset was probably, okay, I have to do this as part of the job. I hate it, but I have to. And I was like, well, how do I have a conversation with this person? I don't even know them. And their point was, well, just act like you don't have all the answers and go ask questions and play dumb. And, I can tell you, looking back, I go, oh, I did not have the answers, and I was actually dumb. And so it wasn't playing, but I had to get past my own ego and say, oh, let's have a conversation. How do you think that I should approach the structure of my team? And those types of questions. How should I handle talent development here? And it was not with really, I'd say my intent was probably manipulative. I don't know that I was consciously aware that was the case, but there was probably an element that I felt like I had to check the box.
Sure, it was self-serving. I don't know if I so far as manipulative, but it was self-serving.
Yeah, self-serving.
And so while I don't want to give like a very specific example, I would say that unfortunately, because it is our job to try and read people, a lot of times when someone comes in my room often, the question does strike up as, what are you here for? Like, right. I won't say that. Internally, I'm trying to read them and see what their motives actually are. Right. So there are people who don't come see me a lot, and that puzzles me. And then there are people who come see me too much, and I'm like, why are you trying to be so chummy? Right. So it all depends on how quickly I think that you can actually really read that employee's or manager's motives. And even when they do come and tell you something that is troubling them, to me, a good HR person tries to get as much objective facts as possible. So you go and try to figure out other things without necessarily trying to blow the top on whatever situation is going on. But you can't just go off of one person's testimony. That will give you a really skewed view and potentially make you make decisions that wasn't the right decision. I will say that the times when you should be seeing your HR person a lot is when you have to have performance conversations, whether you're on the receiving end or the giving end. I've seen a huge difference in the way those conversations have gone because managers have decided to reach out to HR people or people senior than them, more experienced than them, to try and get advice on how to do this properly and effectively.
What would you say is the hardest part? What was the hardest part of the job?
I'm going to speak from a very personal perspective on that. For me, being in HR, the hardest part was the corporate rules of black and white, of right and wrong, the manager versus employee advocacy perspective. In theory, we should be going with management's judgment in a lot of ways because that's why they're there. We chose them for leadership positions, for the correct reasons and they deserve to be there because they have the right qualification. That's in like a very perfect world, but we're all human, and a lot of people make mistakes no matter what kind of position they're in and what kind of salary that they get. And so to always say that we should be listening to our managers didn't always feel right depending on the situation, because people have very, like I said, self-serving motives that wouldn't serve the rest of the team or the rest of the company. So that's something that I struggle with, because I'm very much of on the employee advocacy side of things, objectively speaking, right? Only when everything, all the facts line up. But I felt like that wasn't always something that I was meant or called to do in that environment.
Yeah. So you'd see cases where you're being told we need to back this individual, and you'd say, well, what about the individual contributor, the folks that are, yeah, for sure. And not to mention that's part of the challenge, but you also have, there's a lot of other things that HR gets tasked with beyond just dealing with problem cases, right? So that you can have all these additional things on top of all that. So at least, from my experience, I haven't seen HR folks that were not crazy busy all the time. But I know I have friends who are HR managers at other companies, and they say, I don't know what you guys are doing. That's crazy. Our folks are like we were talking about earlier, we have people who just get bored and just like, I don't have anything else to do here, right? So each company is going to be a little bit different, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. When should an employee go talk to HR about a situation or a manager, right?
Baseline, anytime you see somebody doing anything unethical or something that goes against corporate policy, you should say something about it to somebody. Either you are an organization that has an ethics hotline where you can anonymously submit, or you have an HR person that is there to listen. And this is all under the assumption that you have these departments that are checks and balances in your organization to do these things. But anytime you see something unethical happening, you should definitely go report that to someone.
What about the argument that, well, I'll do it if I see it 2 or 3 times, but that was a one-off case. That was one I struggled with. Is, okay, I see this happening, but is that, can I rationalize it away as a one-off case? So that was something that I struggled with early on as a manager.
I think that's fair. I think that's very human to have that perspective, and no one likes to be a tattletale, and you don't want to cause a dramatic reaction to something that wasn't that big of a deal. So in that case, I suggest people to take notes. Take notes of someone's behavior. If you're an employee and you feel like your manager's treating you unfairly or treating other people unfairly in some kind of way, take notes. I encourage people to include dates, timestamps, direct quotes if you can. And same thing with managers. If you have an issue with someone's performance on your team, take notes. Record and observe patterns of behavior. Don't write down one-time instances and try to use that to try and characterize someone's overall behavior.
Right. I do think that there's a way that you can have a conversation with somebody about whatever the case might be. If you see something like you mentioned that's borderline unethical or against company policy or something, you could tell this is not right. There's ways you can have a conversation with the individual that's not direct, like a tattletelling kind of thing. And then my experience has been like, we always teach people, go, whatever the case is, go have that conversation with your HR person. And like I said, for years, it was like, don't do that. And that was like the unwritten policy. You'd be better off not. No, I disagree. I think you're better off having the advocacy. So, and to me, it's always, okay, yeah, maybe this is a one case. What happens if it's not? What happens if it spirals out of control next week?
Right. I think a lot of those things, when they go unchecked, end up being public anyway, especially in today's age. A company literally went down because someone wrote a blog post about it. Like that stuff happens all the time now. So even if you feel like your company HR is not on your side, or you feel like you reporting something wouldn't matter, I still encourage you to go do that, because all of those things will come to an end at some point if enough people speak up about it. Yeah.
I'll share my own personal horror story. I was about to hire an individual that on the surface, everything looked great. Everything looked fine to me. Strong communicator, everything seemed to be in good condition. And then through close connection and relationship with my HR partner, I was able to get some feedback that this person, a lot of times you have a relationship with people, it's like on the tip of the iceberg. What you see on the surface looks like one thing, and there's this whole other piece. And I didn't have visibility to it, but my HR partner did. And Miss Jane Kim saved my tail and prevented me from making a terrible decision that if you make a bad hire, it just hurts for so long. It hurts for so long. It can be detrimental to a team. And so
you've gone through how many HR people do you think in your career?
6 or 7, 8, 9. I don't know. Maybe a dozen.
Maybe a dozen?
Yeah.
So at least the later ones, the ones that you did make an effort to get to know, how did you do it?
Yeah. So I would find a good thing an area where I would want a second opinion on. And talent development's a really good topic, right? It's say, hey, here's the approach I'm taking to manage talent in my team, and go over the development plans that you have for your individuals and review and get their feedback on those. That's an easy, obvious one. When I'd get a new HR person, I wouldn't even get into that. It would just be, hey, let's have a cup of coffee. We're going to be working together. The more we can get to know each other, the better. And that was hard for me to do early in my career, but I can do that a little easier now. I don't know why that is. More confident, I don't know. But when I didn't know, or I didn't have that confidence or capability, I would guise it with these other questions. And then now I look at it and I go, oh, I really do want this person's perspective. I don't need to use that as an in for a meeting. I do actually value. And the reality is, if you could grab a random person and ask them the same questions, and you're probably going to get some value because you're going to get a different perspective, and yours is limited, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the route that I had been, I've taken over the years that's one example, right? Now, if I have a person on the team that I look at and go, okay, this is going to be a challenge or struggle, just let's go talk about that.
Yeah.
And then get alignment on how should we approach it, right? And most of the time, and I'm probably stealing one of your comments you'd like to make, but most of the time it's associated with people who, if you don't like a job, you're going to struggle with it, right? And that's usually the case, right? And those are usually the conversations that I'm having with HR.
Yeah. As an HR person, I think what I liked the most when I met someone for the first time, because especially a big company, they move you around quite a bit, so you have a whole new set of 200 plus people you have to get to know. And it's really helpful when you bring some form of an elevator pitch to a HR person, asking them questions as well of what they think about where the organization is headed, but also being able to come in and tell them, what are you working on? What do you like to do?
Yeah.
What do you want to do more of? Where do you want to be in 3 years? So those are the kinds of things that's just helpful for HR people to get to know. And also, especially if, like in tech, that's an example that we give in this industry, but because I am not an engineer and I don't have an engineering background, it is really helpful to know actually what you do. It's really not boring. I really did care about knowing some of the even like minute details of it, because that sometimes makes or breaks, how someone is good at something or how someone might not be good at something.
Yeah. I also learned that, oftentimes the folks that I was interacting with on the HR side were, and this didn't necessarily, it just wasn't exclusive to HR. It could be, if you're at a large company, you're going to have multiple functions that you're interacting with that may not know much about your specific function, especially in tech, where you're going to have engineering and finance and all these different components that may exist. Then I found that when I had to go articulate, it was a frustration early in my career, having to articulate the detailed engineering things that we're trying to do to somebody who didn't understand that. I thought it was like, this is not my job. And you should know, why do we hire people who don't understand this stuff, right? I look at it now, and the process of going through that, if I can articulate and explain that to somebody that doesn't have that background, because it's not just HR, it's like I said, it's finance and all these other components. If I get better as a communicator if I can articulate that effectively. And by the way, likely your vice president also doesn't speak the same engineering crazy language that you do, or whatever your function is. You've probably got folks up the chain that have no care factor for your TPS report or your quadratic defibrillator or whatever little goofy thing is that's important to you, your widget. They don't know that. They're focused on something different. So it did help to also, I learned in the process how to effectively communicate with people that didn't understand that background. And that actually made me a lot better, I think.
Yeah. And it helped me learn the organization faster and the different functions in it.
Yeah. So after having done this quite a bit and worked with all kinds of different horror stories and craziness. What qualities would you say separate a successful employee from those who you've observed constantly struggle? And you've been a part of an employee failing and walking them out and going through that process, right? And those are painful days. Certainly for managers, it's very painful. It's like physically traumatizing to go through this process. So having gone through and experienced that, what are the cases where you see what separates somebody who's very successful from somebody who's not?
The number one thing I would say is that a lot of people might be in the wrong kind of job. You just might be in the wrong fit. It might be a personality thing, might be the way that your brain processes information, or your literal skill set that you do or don't have. So when people are just not in the right job, I think it's mostly the direct manager, but HR and everyone benefits off of having people be in the right space. So I think having a self-awareness of knowing whether or not I'm in the right function, and then identifying that and also saying, okay, then what am I a fit for? If you do work in a large organization where there's a lot of different options, there's plenty of room for that conversation. People are moving around jobs all the time. But that's the number one thing that I think people just try to, it's like what do you call it? Square peg in a round hole? It's a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder why people I think sometimes we get recruited, we jump into a spot and we just have a tendency to be lax and stay there, and we don't really, and that's what I'd say. If you're out there and you've had a bad review, or maybe your review's coming up, and if you've gone through that process, use that as a positive. I always hated it when I didn't get any kind of review. Like if I don't know where I stand, that's unfair. That's usually lazy management. I need somebody. You need to be providing me some feedback to get better. Otherwise, I don't know. Like, it's hard for me to believe anything you say, right?
Yeah.
Or I think you're just being lazy, right? Because as a leader, I owe it to the person to give them feedback, and I'll try to be very clear that, hey, it's much like going to a doctor, and you get a shot. It's going to hurt a little bit, but it's better for you. Now, if it doesn't get better for you, you might think about getting a different doctor, right? Which is the same if you're getting feedback and you go, that's not accurate at all. But I would say caution. I'd be careful. There's probably an element of good feedback there.
Yeah.
If you can process and think through it and really take a step back and
sometimes people get hung up on how the feedback was given, and that's fair. If someone gave you feedback in a way that was off-putting, or they just used the wrong words, sure, let them take the blame for that, but don't completely discount what they said because of how it was told.
Sure. Yeah. And I'd say I've tried to get to a point where I can filter through and grab feedback from people independent of how they give it, because I've been in those cases where someone's giving me feedback and they're just butchering it. And it's like, okay, I don't think you meant that at all. Right. People who say always and like never and that type of language.
Words,
it's like you always behave this way. Like those are like the red flags for conflict, right? So over time, I think getting fin. This is a whole separate podcast we'd have to cover. Is being willing to receive feedback and being open to it, and then pursuing it, right? Looking for it, and then if you can get to that point, you can filter through and listen to those cases. Anyway, I
No, you're good.
Took your thread and ran with it.
No, not at all. So I think the wrong fit is a big one. Some people are more born for this than others, but people who work alone tend to just stay in the same spot. The network is huge. I think that's something that will always be around. And the more people that know what you do and the things that you do well, the better off you'll be. So a lot of times when people are too quiet, and no matter how brilliant they are, if no one knows it, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, for sure.
And then people and on the opposite of that, well, I would say opposite, but people who constantly want to learn, you don't have to be ambitious. You don't have to be the person that wants to constantly climb up the ladder. You don't have to want promotions, but there is a genuine and very pure desire that people want to learn more things in their job. And a lot of times that's come from enjoying your job and enjoying what you're doing. But people who want to learn a lot end up naturally becoming successful. And that's very different than like selfish ambition. Yeah.
And those people are often open to feedback, and they're pursuing feedback, and they're looking for ways to get better and stronger and just gain information and knowledge independent of, like, say, of if I do this, I'll see a career advancement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say, and I've learned this from a couple people, Brent being one of them. With a long career, you're going to have times where you really, really dislike what you do, who you work for, whatever it might be. But there are people who are able to stay successful and stay above it all because they just choose to focus on the positive things in their job. And there are times where you come to the end of the road with that as well. But there is a mindset shift when you choose to look at those and put more value and weight into those over the other things that you hate. Because any job you have, you'll always have things that you really dislike to do. Yeah. So the more you can pay attention to the aspects of the job that make it worthwhile, the better off you'll be in terms of your overall attitude.
Yeah, for sure. I think, and if you get to a spot where every day you're dreading going to work, and you really hate the job, it's just a matter of time before you struggle, before you're not able to deliver. Because your point is what I can confirm it. It's consistent. The folks that I've, when I've had employees struggle and had to make changes or had poor performance issues, it's usually associated with someone who really just doesn't enjoy the job, right? So I think if you're really hating your job and it's just a matter of time before you're having that conversation. So you may as well plan for it now, right? And think about what it is that you want to do and try to align that. There's always like this Venn diagram of like what I'm willing to do and what someone's willing to pay me for. And I want that spot in the middle, as big as I can get it, right? Okay, let's talk about a more fun topic. Let's cover business in the Metoo era. So this is a fun conversation. Yeah, absolutely. And so I've certainly experienced it firsthand. I can't speak to firsthand in my career and observed this change. And I think there's a lot of positive as a guy with a 15-year-old daughter. I can appreciate what the movement has done to allow people to speak out to some of the atrocities and things that take place. And it's like, yeah, we should definitely be standing up against some of these things. Is ridiculousness that takes place. And then I've also seen the other side where it can have a negative influence at times. It can create this fear and it creates this awkwardness, and people are not being who they are. When in reality, I don't think we're after. That's not the intent behind the movement, right?
Right. I think with any movement, especially in a shift in power that we see, I think there's always going to be a group of people that are uncomfortable and nervous and fearful because they just don't know how to react. And change is weird for anybody. And then change at a bigger scale is bound to make some people unsure of like how they're supposed to act now. But I want to ask, since there's been blow-ups in different areas, we've seen in the news, in your own workplace, Brent, have you seen a change in the environment or the way people talk to each other, or any noticeable things? Yeah,
I think there's some that's positive. I think there's conversation that takes place that maybe probably should have been taking place all the time. So that's a good thing. I think there's some negative in the sense that there's things that it used to not be a crazy thing for. I'll say it this way. I've had folks say, hey, it would be really cool if we could go have our group outing get-togethers that like we used to do that were like this, but we can't do that in the Me Too era. I'm like, whoa. That has nothing to do with going and having a happy hour is not anti-Me Too movement. That's not the same thing, right? I think those are totally different activities. So that's a result of people who maybe you're kind of swinging the other direction. It's fear-based, I think, and trying to be super cautious, which I can understand and appreciate. But I think that's not the intent of what the activity is. It's I think most people in general you'll know. Yeah. Whether something's appropriate or not, right? Yes. You should know that, right?
And if you don't, or you just have an inkling of an ounce of doubt, just ask somebody.
Yeah, go ask somebody.
Just ask somebody. Yeah. It's not that hard.
Right. Yeah, you need to make a friend that you can go ask that question to.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd recommend you go talk to your HR person about. I would say the best person to talk to about these types of things are your former HR people. Especially when they don't work at the company anymore, because then you're going to get real honest answers, which should motivate you even more to maintain good connection with all of your HR, because one of them eventually will leave, and then you'll have a really good source of information. But yeah, these are touchy topics, and this one I don't know that I would have appreciated it until I had a daughter. It has changed how I look at things and see them. Not that I was some crazy idiot before, but just it was kind of like, oh, there are crazy people out there who do crazy things, and then there's just everybody else, and I don't want to get lumped in with that. So all I do is say nothing. That's all I can do is say nothing, right? Because I know I'm not Bill Cosby, right? I know I'm not this craziness. I don't know if Bill Cosby can sue me for joking about him on my podcast, but whatever, sue me. But I know I'm not that way, but it seems like if you try to go articulate it, you're making it very obvious that you might be. So you just say nothing. Right. And then I think having a daughter, and as my daughter's gotten older, it does change things. Like, I've traveled different places in the world and I see things and I go, holy cow, this is crazy. And I don't know that I would have observed it if I hadn't had a 15-year-old. Right? Yeah. And so I think that's been a positive for me. I think it'd be good if every guy could get that experience somehow.
Yeah, and if you're someone that isn't sure what the Me Too movement is about, or if you're not sure why people are, in some cases, overreacting, or if you're not sure if these things actually happen, or if you think people are telling small exaggerated lies about their experiences, go talk to someone. Everybody has some female figure in their life, whether it's your mom or your sisters or friends.
Yeah.
So go have a conversation with someone. But I think that's what a lot of people don't do with all of this, is that, some people have a lot of assumptions that people are just being exaggerative, or where people are misunderstanding someone's comment.
Right.
And there are some cases of that, sure, but go have a conversation. You don't know what it's like until you've been in that position, and it is really uncomfortable once you've been in that position.
I'm sure I've been responsible for that because I am maybe have a little bit of a reputation at times of being crass, and I provoke for shock value, for humor effect, and for dramatic effect if I'm trying to prove a point and I believe I'm right. It's just the nature of my personality. Yeah, that's right. I tend to do the same thing. I don't flip tables over or anything, but I do provoke for shock value. In fact, it's one of the early critical feedbacks that I got from a really good manager was that I provoked for shock value, and I was like, yeah. You got it in the wrong bucket. That's in the strengths category. But in the process of doing that from time to time, I have caught myself saying things like, that sounded wrong. And I didn't mean it like that at all. Right. So I think there are cases where, and I observe people who now operate out of fear where they just don't communicate it. I can't. I got to dance with what I brought. And that's my personality. So I just have to be, try to be a little more cautious, and at least and have people around you that can tap you on the shoulder and say like, hey, I don't think you meant it this way, but this is what was just said. And then I would chase the people down that were just in the meeting with me. Hey, just make sure I didn't mean to, and apologize. Right. I think that's the only effect I've seen it have specific to me is I'm maybe a little more cautious too. Yeah. Right. But I don't think that's a bad thing. Yeah. That's not a bad thing, because who knows how many times I've done in the past and said nothing and moved on with my day. Right. And that person was left thinking, well, there's another Bill Cosby there, right? I probably should not be using the Bill Cosby reference, but we're in this thing now. It's a prominent one. It's prominent. I think I'm okay.
Yeah, and I've heard people say some what I think are just kind of really ignorant things like, oh, so am I just not supposed to compliment women on the way they dress now? Yeah. And I'm like, no, not in the workplace.
Yeah, that would probably be a bad idea.
Compliment them on how well their presentation went or how they add value to the team. Yeah. You don't need to comment on how nice their pencil skirt is. That really does not matter. Yeah. Go tell a personal friend that. No one needs to know that in the workplace.
I would say away from work, be cautious with that too. That would be my strategy. Like, maybe find something authentic that's not making it so obvious that where your brain's at.
Yeah. They're like, oh, I'll tell them how pretty their eyes are. I'm like, okay, that's also not that great either.
Right. Find something genuine that you can really appreciate about
maybe
the person.
Maybe something not physical about them.
Yeah, maybe compliment them in that way.
Tell them that you really appreciated the time they spent with you.
Because I think everybody's probably had a compliment that felt non-genuine. Mm-hmm. Right. I think every compliment I get is non-genuine, but that's because
you're a cynic.
That's correct. I'm cynical and self-confident, or lack confidence. And so every time somebody, this was really good, I'm waiting for the shoe to fall. I'm like, and where's the butt? Oh, that's it. That was really good. What do you want? What's your agenda? What are you trying to scheme? I don't know what your games are, but I'm going to keep looking at you weird.
That's why I don't compliment Brent.
Don't compliment me. I don't believe it. But on occasion, so for me to get one, it needs to be almost weird, obscure. And then I go, well, I don't know why you would spend that much time thinking about that weird, obscure thing. So maybe it's true. So yeah, be careful with the compliments. Any other advice for people in the Me Too era? Is this generationally different? Do you observe the younger generation versus an older generation of folks in the workplace that operate differently?
I'm going to say something that might be considered controversial.
Let's do it.
So while I do think that there's less tolerance, generational or not, I think in overall speaking, I think there's less tolerance for inappropriate behavior in the workplace since the Me Too era and the scandals and boom and all of that. I do think that it will always be around because it's about a power dynamic. And a power dynamic will always exist in an organization, and someone will want to use power to take advantage of somebody. That'll always happen. I do think that a lot of things go unreported. So in terms of like any advice I'd like to offer, please, I encourage you to report them. If a friend comes and talks to you about something that happened to them and they said, please don't report it, have a conversation with that friend and really encourage them to go report it themselves, because it's honestly the best thing to do for more and more people to talk about these things. Generationally, do I think that it is different? I think there's less tolerance. I think our generation, when I say our, sorry, the millennial generation, is about tolerance for everybody, regardless of who you love, how you identify, what you like, all those things. Like, we're all about tolerance. So I think there is heightened sensitivity to that. But going back to my earlier point, there will always be someone who wants to take advantage of the power that they have. And to be honest, the controversial part is coming, which is there are people who are okay to let people do that. There are some people who are okay with the idea of being taken advantage of out of their own gain of something that they think they're going to get.
Sure.
So as long as those parties exist, it'll happen forever.
Yeah. I find the younger generation is more transparent, open to discuss it. There's more conversation about it. And the more senior folks are, maybe Gen X and Boomer generation are more fearful. I'm just not going to talk about it at all. And I found that's an interesting dichotomy when you mix these two together. And I think we've even talked about this before about the younger folks would say, let's just have the conversation. And the older folks are like, let's bury our head in the sand and pretend this never happened.
Oh, yeah. The millennial generation is probably the most overly communicative generation so far.
Right.
Minus, I'm not sure how to compare that to Gen Zs, but I mean, we tweet our feelings.
Yeah.
All of us are encouraged to go to therapy at some point in our lives. I mean, just overly communicating is just part of our culture.
It is. It's an interesting dynamic. It's totally separate from HR related content, but I had to learn to lead and adapt in that environment and lead all those types of people. And you wind up with folks that you can find out how their day is going or how their project is going by social media status. That's weird. That's unusual for me. That's I don't put those things on social media. Social media is for a picture of a cat, right? Or a dog, or your kid opening a present or something.
So that's like a
not
funny
project
point.
Status.
That's
right?
like a funny point in any articles, or I'm sure there's podcasts that talk about how to manage a millennial. One of the things that they characterize as millennials is people that overshare. Yeah, they're essentially saying that we have less of a boundary in situations, which is very true because of social media. Right. Because we post things about our feelings and pictures of all kinds of stuff we're doing all day. Like this sense of boundary that you have with a stranger or a work associate or whatever is very, very loose for millennials.
So I've observed that. I've observed Me Too joking, Me Too commentary from that generation, and then the older generation just check, please. Can I get out of here as fast as I can? I don't want to get fired. This kind of mentality. So it's a very interesting mixture that's there. And I think somewhere in the middle is probably good, right? So the joking is probably dangerous, but having the conversation is good. And I think I observe some folks that just don't want to have the conversation, which seems to also be dangerous, right? So interesting topic.
But overall, I hope this movement continues in a positive direction. I hope that more and more people realize that when something inappropriate is going on, either they, are doing something inadvertently, but they check themselves, or they're able to check their coworkers when they spot something. Yeah. I just hope that there's less and less happening where people are taken advantage of by other people in positions of power.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's shift gears a little bit here and wrap up. So, Jane, we've talked a little bit about your past in and working in a big company and helping out in these HR type things. But that's not what you do today. So, we've also got quite a few folks that will be listening that are maybe on the fence about starting their own business, working for themselves. I've talked in with other interviews with folks about small business versus large business. What's the right fit for them? Maybe talk a little bit about your personal journey there, or
Sure.
whatever you're willing to talk about.
So I was doing HR, corporate HR for about 4 years. And towards the end of that time, I was genuinely miserable. Like that point we said about finding the positive in your job, I could find almost none. And that went on for months at a time, to the point where it had like physical impact on me. Like I just, had a lot of anxiety, wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping right, all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I realized that it is unreasonable to expect someone to be successful at something they don't like. I think, especially in my culture, I'm Asian American, I'm Korean American. The way I was raised was a lot of, it doesn't matter what it is. If you're bright and if you work hard enough, you can do anything. And so the idea that potentially I wasn't bright or I wasn't working hard enough, maybe that's why I'm not good at this, was really a killing point for me. It was really hard to get over that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I read something that online, and I was like, this is exactly it. It's just so obvious that you can't be good at something you don't like. And so I left the job, and I did interview for HR jobs for a little while until I decided to stop doing that, because I was clearly doing it, just going through the motions. I completely switched gears, and I now work in entertainment, music specifically. I went back completely to the drawing board in the sense that I worked for free for people for a while, doing talent booking, interning at different concert and live event promotion places. And then I did more of that, and people started to reach out and wanted to pay me for it. And then more people wanted to pay me for it. And so I started my own agency. So I run an agency called Axiom Music. It is a bunch of things, mostly artist management, booking, talent buying, and some live event curation and production. It's been a complete 180 in terms of the way that I live my life. My mindset is completely different. The drive that I have and the passion that I have for the job is really different. I would say that my favorite part of going on my own is that the same rules apply in terms of how to be political. Like I try to treat everybody that as if I'm going to work for them one day. That's probably like the number one thing I try to tell people just graduating out of school. Treat everyone you meet as if you're going to work for them one day. I don't care if they're how many years younger they are than you. Just treat them as if you might run into them one day and that you might need something from them. However, what's different about the world I live in now is that if I don't like somebody, if I think you're a jerk, like I don't have to keep working with you. I just have to write out my contract with you, and I can choose not to renew it. In the workplace, that was really difficult. You're kind of stuck with the same people every day until you switch positions, and you have to deal with the same characters every day. Sure. It's like high school. It's like going to high school and seeing the same teachers, seeing the same students every day. But in small business, you have a little bit of that freedom, especially if you're in a position to be choosy with the kind of contracts that you take on. You get to choose to work with people that you think are quality people. And that's been really refreshing. Another thing that I'm really grateful for is that scaling down is a lot easier than scaling up. Yeah. So especially with millennials and Gen Zs, there's this big rush of everybody wanting to join a startup. That's like the sexy thing to do. You join a startup where they give you free beer and unlimited time bank that you never use. Yeah. Or PTO. Yeah. And, they gave you 6 months off maternity leave, but you're working anyway. There's a lot of these benefits that they try to entice you with. But I really encourage people, especially if you're earlier in your career, to really consider working for a place that spends a lot of money on developing their employees.
Sure. And I think there's some value, even in the cases you mentioned of, there's always going to be people that you have to work with you'd rather not. Mm-hmm. But my experience is that person will always exist in some form or fashion. And while in your case you can recognize it, work with them a period of time, and then end the contract, you still have to work with them for a little while, right? And I think being forced to learn to adapt and how to interact and work with those kinds of folks.
Yep.
You'll hear it referred to as demonstrating agility, learning to be agile with all kinds of different personalities.
Saying less. That's the number one thing I learned. Say less.
Yeah.
If you don't have anything nice to say, just don't say anything
Ask
at all.
questions.
Yeah.
Right. Ask questions. It's an easy way. But working with all kinds of people is good. But I do think that's good wisdom if you're debating starting out at the right size company and then working your way the other direction is.
Because nothing's permanent. I actually graduated high school with the idea that I'd go to college, get a degree, and work in the same industry for life, just maybe different companies, and then retire and die one day. And that's so not true these days. People have multiple career changes, not just multiple companies. People have multiple careers in their lifetime. So just because you went for something doesn't mean you have to be there forever. Take what you can from it. Especially in like your early 20s, I think that's when people change the most and you learn the most about how everything in the real world works after school. Yeah. So really going in there and trying to learn from, go to a company where there's a bunch of people older than you, please. That would help you learn so much more faster.
Sure.
Finding a good mentor, all those things. But scaling down, going from a large company, and then I was a part-time at a smaller place, and then now just doing things on my own. It's so much easier because I saw how big ships moved, international ships with 30,000 employees. So running something mostly managed by myself and a couple other people is really, really not that hard. And the idea of scaling bigger from here is also not as daunting because you've seen it done at a really wild scale.
Sure. And I think sometimes there's things that you picked up and learn at that at a larger company that may have been intimidating to you if you just started out, but once you've been through and seen some of the red tape and how the process works, that intimidation decreases. Now, of course, the negative of that is you could lull yourself to sleep and get lax and just sit in one spot and cruise, right? So you have to consciously be aware of what it is that you want to do. Right?
Yeah, and at my first big corporate job, they worked me. They worked me a lot. I mean, with the pace that they made me work was just so much higher than what I've seen since I've left. So people are automatically impressed for no reason at all just because I made a spreadsheet. It's really funny.
You can use Excel?
Oh my God. People think it's crazy that I know how to use Excel.
Okay. Well, our last item to cover here is something we do with each of our episodes, which is what is the minutia detailed thing that if you could go back in time and tell yourself, what advice would you give yourself, 5-10 years ago?
Number one thing would be to not reinvent the wheel. And I think this applies to the technical environment that I learned in and also just the creative environment that I'm in now. But people seem to think that there's something really unique and novel just because you made it up from scratch. But that doesn't mean that it was the best thing that you could have come up with. I think that there needs to be more time that people put into seeing what other people have done before them and trying to improve small things from that, because that alone will actually really impress a lot of people. Yeah. The fact that you took something and processed it and tried to improve upon it, like that alone, I think is an immense skill. And I say this to even creators that I work with, like a lot of musicians. Hit songs are a hit for a reason. Just because you're in a creative industry or a creative endeavor doesn't mean that you shouldn't study and that you should just let everything free flow from your brain. There is, like all things, a formula and a very math-based logical thing that makes things what they are and what makes them so good. So go study those. Even people who play sports, which you could say is a very physical thing, do a lot of mental exercise, looking at plays from other teams, their own plays, imagining themselves hitting threes, like whatever it is. There's a lot of mentalness that comes into all of that. So that was actually a good advice that was given to me, I think my first year that I was in corporate, was that don't reinvent the wheel. Here's a project, and I would have this look on my face. Like it was daunting. Like I was like, I've never done this before. They're like, you're right, you haven't, but other people have. Here's a bunch of resources, here's a bunch of archive files that hasn't been touched in a while. Go look through these and try to figure it out.
Here's a spreadsheet.
There you go. VLOOKUPs.
It was all that was holding you back. Yeah. Yeah. Now you can achieve your dreams. All right. What about, was that, and then the other half of it is what bit of minutia detail drains you that you have to deal with all the time?
So when I was in HR, it was really routine things. Head count. The way it was done was just so asinine. Am I allowed to say that?
I guess.
And a lot of it's because the right systems were not in place. So like if you're someone that manages a large team or you run a company, please make systems easy for people to get reports and things like that in a really easy way. But people would spend hours trying to get headcount reports correctly, and I just never understood why it had to be that way.
Yes.
And people, it was also like a thing to complain about. Like people loved complaining about it. It was odd. It's like complaining about flying and like flight delays. Everybody does them.
We were joking about this in the office in the last couple of weeks, where I think sometimes like they'll roll out some new IT software or something that we're all working with, and I wonder if they intentionally roll out like crappy software because it's like the beginning of every meeting, it unifies us to gripe about it. I find we're coming together as a team with our unified hatred of a piece of software that we all have to use. And I go, that's actually pretty good psychological tactic to use.
It's like all the kids in the schoolyard coming together and hanging out because they all hate the lunch lady.
Exactly. Yeah.
In HR, it was that stuff. It was like really mundane things that I was like, why am I spending time doing this when I feel like it should be done with a report? Today, in the world that I live in music agency world, I don't care a lot about social media. I totally understand the value of it. I understand that we cannot live without it, and it's basically what runs overall marketing and promotions. But for whatever reason, like doing the hashtags and thinking of captions and trying to post regularly, like that just really is not something that I'm into. So I have people that help me with it, which is amazing. People who enjoy more things like that. There's also a very big like aesthetic piece to social media these days, which that's not a strong suit of mine. You should know what you're not good at.
Yeah, definitely.
And then there's just the basic like scheduling and managing people's calendars. I manage artist calendars, their bookings and things like that. And that's just the literal minutia where I'm like, I wish I didn't have to do this, but I have to.
Yeah. Some of that stuff is necessary.
Yeah.
Not much you can do about it, right?
Exactly.
Certainly small company versus big company. Everybody's got their own share of it. Yeah.
And you're going to have to deal with some of this social media stuff soon.
Absolutely. A little bit now. I get to deal more with it just by having a 15-year-old. Social media, I see tremendous danger in it compared to the perspective. What I use YouTube for versus what my kids use YouTube for, it's very different. I use it to figure out how to fix the refrigerator. Because within 5 minutes, it's not quite like the Matrix where I can download the ability to fly a helicopter, but it's close. I can watch YouTube for a few minutes and I get the basics of how to fix the refrigerator down.
Yeah.
My kids will watch it and binge for 4 hours.
They watch it like TV.
And they'll go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And there's no regulation in YouTube in terms of what's real fact versus what's fake news.
Right.
And so I'll find cases where they'll come to me and say, hey, did you know blah, 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 blah? Like that's the opposite of factual information. I don't know where you're seeing this garbage, but that is not accurate information, right? So,
one day your show will be on YouTube.
Yeah, maybe
someone's
so.
going to be saying exactly the same thing.
I'll have nasty comments in the bottom about how I'm anti-Bill Cosby.
Someone's be like, hey, Dad, this guy told me that I should be really tight with my HR person. He's like, that's garbage. You stay far away.
Yeah,
far
one
away.
I think that one I've stuck with for maybe 10 years. So I'm going to hold tight to that advice. I highly recommend, if you take nothing else from this episode, is that you need to maintain a close relationship, probably more than just HR, but certainly with your HR folks, independent of how powerful they are. It can't hurt to have them part of your network and to be able to advocate for you, whether you're a manager or individual contributor in a company. If you're a company that's got no HR because you work for yourself or just a couple folks, you may be all right in that case. Just take notes. Remember and get along with each other, because you're not going to have anybody to help manage the in-between. But if you're at a larger company, I would strongly recommend it. Jane, thanks for the time. This was a good episode.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been fantastic.
It's been fun.
Thanks, folks. I have a really great Metoo story that I wanted to share, but I'm not going to put it here. I'm actually going to put it out on our Facebook discussion group, and that's my call to action for everybody this week, is to go out onto our Facebook discussion group, and I'll have the story there. And how would a person get to this?
Facebook.com/Business Minutia Discussion.
And we'll also have a link down here on the website so that you can chase that down. Go listen to that story, and I really would like to hear some thoughts and inputs from you guys on future topics, but also when you hear the story that's there, let me know about similar misunderstandings between the genders that can create some Me Too problems as well.
That ought to bring in some pretty good stories, Brent. I like it.
I think so. I'm scared of the stories, but that's okay. Scared is good. Scary is good. A little controversy is definitely okay. Yeah.
Open discussion is good.
Yeah, open discussion is definitely good. Thanks, everybody, for listening this week. Catch you next week.